There was a king God called a man after my own heart, yet this same man would become a cold-blooded murderer over a single glance. Picture King David on his palace roof, watching Bathsheba bathe in the golden afternoon light. That moment of lust would lead him to seduce a loyal soldier's wife and orchestrate the most calculated murder in biblical history. But here's the shocking twist. While Uriah died as a hero on the battlefield, God was watching every move. The price he demanded wasn't just guilt, it was the innocent child's life. What happened next unleashed a family curse that would turn David's sons against each other in the most brutal ways imaginable. This story will shatter everything you think you know about divine justice. Spring had arrived in Jerusalem, the season when kings march out to war. But King David remained behind in his palace while his commander Joab led the entire army to besiege Rabbah of the Ammonites. Picture this, the most powerful king in the region, the man after God's own heart, choosing comfort over duty. His soldiers were sleeping on hard ground, eating rations, facing arrows and spears. David was sleeping on silk cushions in climate-controlled chambers. 2 Samuel 11:1 tells us exactly what happened. In the spring, at the time when kings go out to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. Read that again. David sent Joab. The king who had once faced Goliath with nothing but a sling was now sending others to fight his battles. Think about what this meant for the morale of his troops. Every soldier marching toward enemy territory knew their king was back home, comfortable and safe. Every officer setting up camp in hostile territory understood that while they risked their lives, David was enjoying palace luxuries. This wasn't just a strategic decision, it was the first crack in the foundation of his integrity. The afternoon heat pressed down on Jerusalem as David lay in his royal chambers for his customary rest. The palace walls were thick stone, designed to keep the rooms cool, even when the sun blazed overhead. While his men sweated under armor and leather in the wilderness, David dozed peacefully, but something stirred him awake earlier than usual that day. David rose from his bed and walked through the corridors of his palace. His feet carried him upward, step by step, until he reached the flat roof that crowned his residence. From this elevated position, he could survey much of Jerusalem spread below him. The city bustled with activity even in the afternoon heat. Merchants calling their wares, children playing in the streets, women drawing water from wells. Then he saw her. From his high vantage point, David's eyes fell upon a woman bathing in a courtyard below. The late afternoon sun caught the water as it cascaded over her skin, making it gleam like polished bronze. She moved with unconscious grace, completely unaware that she was being watched. Her long hair fell in wet tendrils down her back. The gentle rise and fall of her breathing was visible even from David's distance. David should have turned away. Any man of integrity, any king who valued his covenant with God, would have immediately averted his gaze and returned to his chambers. But David didn't turn away. He fixed his eyes on her and let his imagination run wild. He watched her every movement, studying the curve of her form, allowing desire to build in his chest like a fire being fed with dry wood. Think about that moment. David had multiple wives already. He had concubines. He lacked nothing in terms of physical companionship, yet here he stood on his rooftop, lusting after a woman he had never met, a woman who belonged to another man. The man who had once refused to harm King Saul because he was the Lord's anointed was now mentally violating someone else's wife. The longer David watched, the more his heart raced. What had begun as an accidental glimpse became a deliberate act of voyeurism. He wasn't just seeing, he was consuming her with his eyes. His breathing quickened as he imagined what it would be like to touch that skin, to hold that body against his own. Every second he remained on that rooftop, every moment he continued to stare, he was making a choice that would lead to catastrophe. Finally, David forced himself to descend from the roof. But the damage was already done. The image was burned into his mind. The desire had taken root in his heart. Instead of going to his chambers to pray, instead of seeking God's help to purify his thoughts, David made a decision that would destroy lives. He called for a servant, one of the many palace attendants who lived to fulfill the king's every whim. David's voice carried the authority of absolute power as he issued his command, "Find out who that woman is." The words came out more urgently than he intended, betraying the intensity of his interest. The servant recognized the tone. This wasn't casual curiosity. This was a royal order that demanded immediate action. The servant hurried out into the streets of Jerusalem. In a city where everyone knew everyone else's business, it wouldn't take long to identify a woman of such obvious beauty and grace. The servant moved quickly through the narrow streets, asking questions, gathering information. Neighbors were always eager to share what they knew, especially when the inquiry came from the palace. Within the hour, the servant returned with a full report. David waited in his chambers, pacing like a caged lion. When the servant entered and bowed, David couldn't hide his anticipation. The information came in clear, devastating detail. "Her name is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam," the servant reported. The name itself was beautiful. Bathsheba meant daughter of the oath, or daughter of abundance. But then came the detail that should have ended David's interest immediately. She is the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Think about what David heard in that moment. Uriah the Hittite wasn't just any soldier. He was one of David's mighty men, one of the elite warriors who had proven their loyalty in countless battles. Uriah was at that very moment risking his life for his king, fighting David's war, leading David's troops into danger. While Uriah served faithfully on the battlefield, David was lusting after his wife. Any honorable man would have stopped right there. The knowledge that she was married, especially to one of his own valiant warriors, should have been like ice water poured over his burning desire. David had built his reputation on loyalty and righteousness. He had spared Saul's life multiple times out of respect for God's anointed. He had shown mercy to his enemies and justice to his people. But sin had already taken hold. Instead of backing away, instead of repenting of his lust, David made the choice that would set in motion a series of events leading to adultery, murder, and the sword that would never depart from his house. The man after God's own heart was about to become a predator. David looked at his servant and spoke the words that would change everything. "Bring her to me," not a request, a royal command. He summoned his messengers, the official representatives who carried the king's orders throughout the realm. When they appeared before him, David gave them their instructions with the full weight of his authority behind every word. The messengers departed the palace and made their way through the city toward Bathsheba's home. The heavy knock echoed through Bathsheba's house like thunder in a clear sky. She had been going about her evening routine when the sound shattered the quiet of her home. When she opened the door, her heart stopped. Standing before her were the king's messengers, men whose presence at any doorway meant only one thing: the king required something. These weren't ordinary servants. They wore the royal insignia, carried themselves with the authority of the throne, and spoke with voices that expected immediate obedience. Bathsheba recognized them instantly. Every citizen of Jerusalem knew the faces of David's official representatives. "King David summons you to the palace," one of them announced. The words were simple, direct, and terrifying. This wasn't an invitation. It was a royal command. In David's kingdom, when the king called, you came. There was no discussion, no negotiation, no refusal. Think about what raced through Bathsheba's mind in that moment. Why would the king want to see her? She was nobody special, just the wife of a soldier fighting in the king's army. She had never been to court, never had any dealings with royal affairs. The only logical explanation was that something had happened to Uriah. Her husband must be dead, wounded, or missing, and the king was summoning her to deliver the news personally. Bathsheba's hands trembled as she quickly gathered herself. She had no choice but to comply immediately. To keep the king's messengers waiting would be an act of disrespect that could bring severe consequences. She dressed hurriedly, her mind spinning with worry about what news awaited her at the palace. The walk through Jerusalem's streets felt like a death march. Her sandals struck the hot stones with each step as the messengers led her through the winding paths toward the royal residence. The evening air was still warm from the day's heat, but Bathsheba felt cold with dread. Other citizens they passed stopped and stared. Everyone recognized the king's men, and seeing them escort a woman to the palace sparked immediate curiosity and whispered speculation. Picture those streets. Narrow, crowded with merchants closing their shops, children playing their final games before being called inside for the night, women drawing water from the public wells. All of this normal life continued around Bathsheba as she walked toward what she believed would be devastating news about her husband. The palace loomed ahead, its massive walls and imposing gates a reminder of David's power and authority. The messengers led her through courtyards she had never seen, past guards who watched with curious eyes, up stone steps that grew more elaborate with each level. The higher they climbed, the more isolated she became from the familiar world below. When they reached the royal chambers, the messengers stepped aside and motioned for her to enter alone. Bathsheba crossed the threshold into a world of luxury she had never experienced. The air was thick with the scent of expensive incense. Tapestries from foreign lands covered the walls, golden fixtures caught the light from oil lamps that cast dancing shadows across the room. And there was David. The king stood waiting for her. But something was wrong. This wasn't the posture of a man preparing to deliver tragic news about a fallen soldier. His eyes weren't filled with sympathy or sorrow, they were filled with hunger. The same look she had unknowingly been observed with from the rooftop. In that instant, Bathsheba understood with horrible clarity why she had been summoned. David approached her without a word. His hands reached up to touch her face, fingers tracing the curve of her cheek with a familiarity that had no right to exist. Bathsheba felt the crushing weight of his authority, the invisible crown that made resistance impossible. She was alone in the palace of the most powerful man in the kingdom, with no witnesses, no protection, no escape. Think about her position. David wasn't just any man. He was the king. He held the power of life and death over every citizen in his realm. Her husband served under his command. Her family's survival depended on his goodwill. To refuse the king could mean disaster, not just for her, but for everyone she loved. David led her to his bed, and what happened next was inevitable. 2 Samuel 11:4 tells us simply, "Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her." Read those words again. The text doesn't describe romance or seduction. It describes power being exercised and submission being demanded. When it was over, Bathsheba performed the ritual purification required by the law and left the palace. The same messengers who had brought her there escorted her back through the darkened streets to her home. But everything had changed. The woman who walked back was not the same one who had been summoned hours earlier. David remained in his chambers, savoring what he thought was a moment of conquered pleasure. He had seen, he had desired, he had taken. In his mind, it was over. A single night's satisfaction with no lasting consequences. But sin never works that way. What seems like a moment of pleasure always carries a price that extends far beyond the act itself. Days passed in apparent normalcy. David resumed his royal duties. Bathsheba returned to her daily routines. On the surface, life in Jerusalem continued as if nothing had happened. But beneath the surface, something was growing that would shatter both their worlds. Bathsheba began to notice changes in her body. The morning nausea that came in waves, the sensitivity to certain foods, the exhaustion that seemed to come from nowhere. She tried to dismiss these signs at first, hoping they meant something else. But as the days continued, the reality became undeniable. She was pregnant. The magnitude of this disaster crashed over her like a collapsing wall. Her husband had been away for months, fighting the king's war. There could be no explanation for her condition except the obvious one. When Uriah returned, her shame would be visible to everyone. Under the law, adultery was punishable by death. With no other choice, Bathsheba sent a messenger to the palace with 2 words that would change the course of history. "I am pregnant." The messenger arrived at the palace gates with dust on his robes and urgency in his step. When he was brought before King David, the 2 words he delivered hit like physical blows. "She's pregnant." David's face drained of color as he sat on his throne. The blood seemed to leave his entire body in that instant. Think about what raced through his mind. The scandal that would erupt when Bathsheba's condition became visible. The questions that would be asked, the consequences that would follow. His sin, which he had thought safely buried in the past, was about to be exposed for all to see. But David was a strategist, a man who had survived years of warfare and political intrigue. Even in his panic, his mind began calculating solutions. If Bathsheba was pregnant with his child, there was one way to cover the scandal. Make it appear the child belonged to her husband. Uriah needed to return from the war immediately and sleep with his wife. Then when the child was born, everyone would assume it was conceived during his visit home. David called for a scribe and began dictating a message with forced calm in his voice. "Send this to Joab immediately," he commanded. The message was brief and seemingly innocent. "Send me Uriah the Hittite." No explanation, no elaborate reasoning, just a simple request for one soldier to be sent back to Jerusalem. Picture the irony of that moment. David was summoning the very man he had wronged, calling back the loyal soldier whose wife he had violated, requesting the return of one of his most faithful warriors, so he could manipulate him into unknowingly covering his king's sin. The message traveled the dusty roads from Jerusalem to the battlefield where Joab commanded the siege of Rabbah. When Joab received the scroll bearing the royal seal, he read it with the practiced eye of a military commander who had served David for years. The request was unusual. Why would the king need one specific soldier in the middle of an active campaign? But Joab had learned not to question David's orders. He found Uriah among the mighty men, the elite warriors who formed the core of Israel's fighting force. Uriah the Hittite stood out even among these valiant soldiers. Though born a foreigner, he had proven his loyalty to Israel's God and Israel's king through countless battles. His commitment was absolute, his courage unquestioned, his integrity beyond reproach. "The king has summoned you to Jerusalem," Joab told him. Uriah's weathered face showed surprise, but no hesitation. "When your king called, you went. No questions asked, no delays permitted." Uriah prepared for the journey immediately. He saddled his horse, gathered minimal provisions, and set out for the capital. The ride from Rabbah to Jerusalem covered rough terrain under a merciless sun. Dust clouds followed his horse's hooves, coating his uniform and settling in his beard. But Uriah pushed hard, knowing that speed was essential when responding to a royal summons. When he arrived at the palace, Uriah presented himself exactly as a disciplined soldier should. Despite the grueling journey, he had cleaned himself as best he could and entered the royal presence with proper respect. He approached David's throne and bowed low, showing the deference due to his sovereign. David looked down at this man whose life he was about to attempt to manipulate. Uriah stood before him, covered in the dust of loyal service, his hands calloused from gripping weapons in defense of the kingdom, his face marked by the sun and wind of the battlefield. This was a man who had left comfort behind to fight David's wars while David himself remained in luxury. "How is Joab doing?" David asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "How goes the war? How are the people faring?" These were the questions a concerned king might naturally ask a soldier returning from the front lines. But David's real purpose had nothing to do with military updates. Uriah gave a detailed report with the precision of an experienced officer. He described the progress of the siege, the condition of the troops, the strategies Joab was employing against Rabbah's defenses. Every word demonstrated his competence and his complete focus on the mission he had left behind. David listened with feigned interest, waiting for the right moment to implement his plan. When Uriah finished his report, the king spoke the words he hoped would solve his problem: "Go down to your house and wash your feet." The instruction seemed natural enough. After a long journey on dusty roads, any traveler would want to clean up and rest in the comfort of home. David even arranged for a gift to be sent after Uriah, food from the royal table, a gesture that would appear generous but was actually calculated to encourage the soldier to stay home and enjoy an intimate evening with his wife. Uriah left the palace as instructed, and David's gift followed behind him. The plan seemed simple and foolproof. Uriah would go home, see Bathsheba, and do what any husband would do after time apart on the battlefield. By morning, David's problem would be solved. But when Uriah reached his house, something unexpected happened. Bathsheba, watching from a window, saw her husband approach their door. Her heart raced with a mixture of joy at seeing him alive and terror at what his presence might mean. But instead of entering the house, Uriah stopped at the threshold. He looked at the familiar entrance to his home, then turned away. Uriah walked to where the palace servants slept, men who attended the king but had no homes of their own in Jerusalem. He spread his cloak on the ground and lay down among them, choosing to sleep outside in the courtyard rather than enter the comfort of his own house. Think about that decision. After weeks or months of sleeping on hard ground in enemy territory, after a long journey back to Jerusalem, after being dismissed by the king to rest and refresh himself, Uriah chose to sleep on stone rather than in his own bed beside his wife. When morning came, the palace guards made their routine reports to David.